We are still in Isaiah chapter 6, where we have the 6 chapters, the call of Isaiah, where he first sees Jehovah. It is in the year that King Uzziah died, and the 2 seraphim that he sees are praising God, crying one to another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And then after that, in verse 5, the prophet sees himself and realizes his sinful condition, because he had seen the Lord of hosts. And he says, he was undone, he was a man of unclean lips, and dwelled in a midst of a people of unclean lips. So verse 6 and verse 7 then, he is cleansed. One of the seraphim flew and gets a coal from off of the altar and goes to Isaiah and touches his lips and says, "Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged." So we discussed that quite extensively last week, and then had started verse 8, but verses 8 through verse 10, we have Isaiah's commission. And in verse 8, when he says, "Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me." And we noted that the us there certainly hints at the plural nature, let me put it that way, the plural nature of the Godhead. Now then, through additional revelation, we know that there are 3 divine beings. But at this point in time, we might not have known that. But here's God's question: who will go for us? We also realize in this that God does not act directly. Why did God need someone to go for him? Now, you're dealing with a message from God to Israel. Why didn't God just tell Israel directly? Why did he need someone to go for him? Well, if he revealed it, then what difference? Why would he need someone to go for him if he revealed it?
I guess the same reason that they went to, he sent his messenger to tell anybody that was deceived.
Okay, same reason. Well, what's the reason? that he sends a prophet or a messenger to.
Maybe they'll listen.
But he created man a free moral agent, so that's the way he works. He doesn't do it miraculously overwhelming. So he sends a human messenger to spread his message to the humans.
He uses a human messenger, but why? That's the question. If he tells everyone the same message, you would not be able to respect their persons then, Pam.
Isn't there a scripture that says he chose to send it in earthen vessels?
Okay, in 2 Corinthians 5, that they were earthen vessels. Now, in the earthen vessels, within the context there is the apostles. But the fact is, and the reason is, that God always uses human agents. in the spread of his message. He never acts directly in relationship to a message to the people.
I thought that's what I was saying.
You thought you were saying that? God doesn't act directly. That's the point that I was wanting to. I'm not talking about overwhelming them. I'm just talking about giving the message.
Well, they would be overwhelming to understand what I want you to do without anybody telling you. Direct operation of the Spirit.
No, you don't have to have a direct operation of the Spirit upon the heart. Okay, if I tell Henry, I want you to replace the light. I've told him directly. I haven't overwhelmed him. I haven't forced him to do it. He still retains his free moral agency. But then, Paul, if I tell you to tell Henry to do that, same thing. I haven't overwhelmed him. It's not a direct operation, but I've used an agency of, in this case, Paul, to tell Henry instead of telling him directly. God always uses that human agency. He could have told people directly, but he does not work that way. He uses man to deliver that. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 11, in verse 10, there's the discussion of we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, whether it be good or evil. And then verse 11, he says, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. He didn't use angels to persuade men. He did not persuade men directly. He always uses that human agency. So, who will go for me? There's the need to go to people and tell them that message. Since he's not going to do it directly, or he does not act directly. By the way, you could say the same thing in relationship to the Ethiopian eunuch. Why did God tell Philip to go to that place and to join himself to that Ethiopian eunuch? Why didn't God just tell him that message directly? Same thing with Saul of Tarsus. When Saul asked, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? Well, go into the city and it will be told you what you must do. And so what does he do? He sends Ananias. Now, could he have told him directly what to do? He could have, but he doesn't work that way. Same thing here. If the world today is going to know about the gospel, how are they going to come to know it? It's always going to be the same way, through the agency of man. Man going out and telling them. And so there's that question here, who will go for us? With Isaiah, he says, here am I, send me. It implies that he is not only there, but that he is ready and willing to go on God's behalf. He was willing, there's a willingness that has to be there for us to take the message of God of salvation to man today. There has to be a willingness on our part. If we're not willing to do it, are we going to do it? Well, let me ask, how many of you are going to do something that you really don't want to do? Sometimes you are forced to, but then that's a different matter. We have to do certain things. whether we want to or not. Although some people say the only things that you have to do are pay taxes and die. There's a few other things in there that we have to do, even though we might not want to. But when you're dealing with the free agency of man, you have the choice to do it or not. If you don't want to, how many of us are going to do it? If we're given the choice, we don't have to do it. Well, that's the thing. I'm saying if you don't want to, you wouldn't do it, would you? There has to be a willingness to do it. God doesn't force us in that sense to go out and spread the gospel, does He? We have to have the desire to do it.
We have to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Well, there's a lot of motivations that we could talk about, but the fact is there has to be the desire, the willingness. Isaiah had the willingness to do it. He was willing to go. And we mentioned at the end of the class last week how that God did not command Isaiah to go. It was voluntary on his part. God simply asked the question, and he volunteers his service to God. Christianity itself is voluntary, isn't it? Go back to that passage in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 11. We do what to men? We persuade. We persuade them to become a slave for Christ. Now then, that when we think about slavery and voluntary, that doesn't really harmonize in our minds because of our view of slavery. But it is a voluntary slavery in relationship to Christ. We voluntarily place ourselves under God and His will so that we lose our will in Him.
That shows the confidence you have got to have in God.
It does show the confidence that you have to have in God, yes. That He will do what He says, and when we are obedient to Him, we can have the confidence that He will forgive us, that He will save us eternally in heaven. But we all need to develop that desire that Isaiah had to go. There's a song that we sing based upon this. What's the name of it?
There's much to do.
There's much to do. There's work on every hand. And then the chorus, "Here am I, send me." But a lot of Christians will sing that, but then when the work is there and needs to be done, they won't do anything. They want to sit back and let someone else do it. And this is kind of as an aside in relationship to that. It's wrong for us to preach false doctrine. It's wrong for us to sing false doctrine. But isn't it also just as wrong to sing something that is a lie on our part? So if we're not willing to go to do the work, then we really shouldn't be singing that song. Well, we should be singing the song. We need to change our attitude is really what it is. And not sing a lie, but sing the truth because we are willing to go. But Isaiah's attitude here is a marvelous attitude. Here am I, send me. In verse 9 then, and he said, Go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. God is here letting Isaiah know that the message that he tells the people, that he's going to proclaim, the message from God, is going to fall on deaf ears. They're not going to listen. Even though God desired them to listen and to heed the message, and no doubt Isaiah desired the people to hear the message, to repent and have salvation or deliverance. But God is letting him know they're not going to. They're not going to listen. That attitude really spans I have centuries, probably ought to say millennial. It culminated finally in the rejection of Christ and his crucifixion, especially dealing with the Jews now, the centuries that from Isaiah's time all the way down to the time of Christ. That attitude was prevalent among the Jewish people that culminated in Christ's rejection and crucifixion. Christ uses this, along with the next verse, as being fulfilled in his time. Someone turn over to Matthew 13 and read verses 13 through 15 for us. Matthew 13 through 15.
Therefore speak I to them in parables. Speak I to them in parables, because they see and see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and with their ears, and should understand with their heart. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. Okay.
Got it that time. He calls upon what was told to Isaiah. And he says that what Isaiah said, or God said to Isaiah, of the people of Isaiah's time, was exactly the same in the people of Jesus' time. Someone turn over to Acts the 28th chapter and read verses 25 through 27. Acts 28, 25 through 27.
And when they agreed not among themselves, they departed after that Paul had spoken one word. Well spake the Holy Ghost by Isaiah the prophet unto our fathers, saying, Go unto this people and say, Hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see and not perceive. For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them.
So you have here Paul, and he is now at Jerusalem. He's called for Rome. He's called for the Jews that were at Rome, the leaders in particular, to come, and he's discussed with them about the gospel, and they are rejecting it. And he says, here's what Isaiah said, and it's being fulfilled in the people that Paul was talking to at that time. Do you get the idea that this is something that happens all of the time? It's not something new. It's something that's as old as man itself. You could say, when God created Adam and Eve, placed them in the garden, he tells them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What did they do? Well, they closed their eyes, they closed their ears, and they ate of the tree. And you could just go on throughout history. What about our day? Would this be very expressive of the people of our day and our nation in particular? Now, there might be some areas in which the gospel or the people are receptive to the gospel. But in our nation today, that's really not the situation, is it?
It's always the remnant. Isaiah 4 and 10 mention the remnant. Always a very small minority.
There's always a very small minority. Jesus said in Matthew the 7th chapter in verse 13 and 14 that the majority of people are going to be lost. That's true no matter what time period, no matter what location you're dealing with, the majority of people are going to be lost. So it's really nothing that we should be surprised about it. Someone turn over to John the 12th chapter and read verses 37 through 41 for us. John 12, 37 through 41.
But though they had so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him. That the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report? And to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said again, he hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. These things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of it.
Okay. Interesting point here. That Christ is saying in this situation, Isaiah was prophesying of whom? Christ and the people of his day. So the fulfillment of it, or Christ is basically saying, Isaiah saw the second person of the Godhead in this. And so there's that aspect as well in seeing, and if you look at verse 3, the seraphim crying, holy, holy, holy is what? The Lord of hosts. What's the word Lord there? Okay, it's all cap, or actually small cap is what it's called. And it refers to, thus, Jehovah, or Yahweh. Now then, when Jesus says he was prophesying of me and he sees the second person of the Godhead in this, what's he claiming? He's claiming to be Yahweh or Jehovah in what he is saying. thus remember, and this is not the only time in the book of Isaiah that we will see this, that Jehovah or Yahweh is basically the same way as the term God, and we use Godhead a lot of times to express it. Some people, or most, call it Trinity. It's not a Bible term. It probably expresses the idea well, but I still like the term Godhead myself. You have the three distinct persons all having the characteristics, the nature of God. Same can be said of Jehovah or Yahweh. All three distinct individuals, but expressing, or that they each have the characteristics, the nature of Yahweh or Jehovah. So Jehovah and God are the same in that sense. Notice also something else in verse 9. He said, go and tell who? Not the people. This people. Now, the reason I'm making a distinction, it is not my people. Turn over to Exodus 32, and in verse 9, he says, and the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, behold, it is a stiff-necked people. They're stiff-necked people. They're not his people anymore. They are stiff-necked. They rebelled against him. Turn over to Numbers, the 11th chapter, and verses 10 and verse 11. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased, and Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight? That thou layest the burden of all this people upon me. Now this is Moses saying this to God, but it's not God's people, not his people or your people, if you can use that phrase. It's this people. Why? Because of all of their complaining and griping and on it goes. And so it's this people, not God's people. You see the same thing in Numbers, the 14th chapter, in verse 19. Pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of thy mercy, and as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. God, you've always been forgiving of them. Forgive them now. Forgive this people. They're not your people anymore. Yet, we could go back and we already know God referred to them as my people all the time. They were his people. They were a special nation unto him. I will be their God. You shall be my people. But now then, when they rebel, when you see this stiff-necked people turning away from God or rejecting God, they're no longer God's people. There's that change that takes place from my people to this people. Now then, that is a argument that could be used in relationship to once saved, always saved. If once saved, always saved were true, then they would always have been God's people, or for saying it from God's standpoint, my people. But they weren't. Because they had forsaken God, they had rejected Him, and thus now then they were lost, even though they were at one time His people. So they went from being my people to no longer my people, but this people. Same thing can be said today. Verse 10, then. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert, and be healed. In the passages that we read just a moment ago, it included this verse as well. But what you see here is preaching God's message does not always result in a positive response from the hearer. In fact, the majority of time, it's going to be a negative response on the part of the hearer. I wish I could remember the exact figures, but I read an article years ago that was talking about salesmen and how many times a salesman had to go to a company in order to make a sale. And the majority of them quit before they ever got a sale made. It seems like on average a sale was not made until the 13th visit. Now then, if you're a salesman, how many times are you going to go back to the same person trying to get a sale that many times? That's why most of them quit before they made a sale. Depends on how bad you want the sale. But generally we're going to say, well, I've been there often enough, I'm going to greener pastures. That's our general attitude about it. But the point is, you have to go back and you have to repeat it. You have to keep going. You have to keep going. You have to keep going. The negative responses are going to be there the most of the time. It's our duty simply to go and proclaim the message. The response of the individual is not ours. It's theirs. Success is determined by our obedience to God, not what the hearer does with the message. Was Isaiah successful? Yes. He obeyed God, thus he was successful. Was he successful in the response of the people? Well, no, he wasn't. God's telling him at this point, the people are not going to hear you. They're going to reject the message. But your success is not determined by what they do. Your success is by your obedience to what you're being told to do. What Isaiah is being told to do. J.W. McGarvey made this comment about this verse. And quote, "The true meaning is that God commanded Isaiah to teach, even though the people, by hardening themselves against his teaching, should be made worse rather than better by it. Thus, though rebellious, Israel might not be blessed by Isaiah's teaching. They might, by their example, waken a wholesome fear in their posterity and cause it to avoid sin, cause it to avoid like sin." End quote. And that's probably hits this meaning of what we're seeing here. Make the heart of this people fat, make their ears heavy, shut their eyes. You're going with a message, and yes, it is a message of salvation. It's a message that will bring deliverance, but instead of making the people better, in reality, you've made them fat and lazy, and you've ended up making them worse than better by preaching the message of God. Remember in 2 Peter, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 20, I think particularly, what Peter tells about someone who knows the truth and forsakes it. And he goes on through verse 22, the end of the chapter. Remember what he says there? It would be better for them not to have known the way of truth than after having known it to depart from the living God. And gives a couple of illustrations then. In other words, it would have been better for them not to have known the truth than to hear it, to obey it, to know it, and then go back. By preaching the message to the people, Isaiah is making them responsible, a greater responsibility. They were still responsible to God, but they had a greater responsibility now because God was sending a prophet to them to tell them what to do. And now then, they were rebelling against it. And so they were, in reality, made worse. Their rebelliousness against what Isaiah taught and what they needed to do just drove them to further rebellion and to continuing in even worse evils than before. And that's what he's saying here. You're making the heart of this people fat. Verses 11 through 13 then, Isaiah is given the outcome of his preaching. And it's not going to be pretty. Verse 11 through verse 13, he says, Then said I, Lord, how long? And he answered, Until the cities be wasted and without inhabitant, and the houses without man, and the land be utterly desolate. And the Lord have removed men far away, and there be a great forsaking in the midst of the land. But yet in it shall be a tenth, and it shall return, and shall be eaten as a teil tree, and as an oak, whose substance is in them. When they cast their leaves, so the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. Isaiah wants to know how long. How long, O Lord? Now then, we could ask the question, what is Isaiah asking here? Is he asking, how long am I to preach this message? Or is he saying, how long will the nation continue in sin without being destroyed? That's why he's asking the second one there. To be honest, I had always taken it as the first, how long do I have to preach this message? I now think both ideas are being expressed in his question. How long? How long do I have to preach the message? How long till they are destroyed? Both aspects involved. And God's response is, you continue preaching to those cities until they are destroyed. Well, let's get verse 12, and then I want it kind of combine these two. The Lord have removed men far away, and there be a great forsaking in the midst of the land. When is God going to remove the inhabitants to a faraway land? Well, if you're dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel, when did they go into captivity?
721 or 2.
Okay, it was Assyrian captivity, but it was at 722 BC. That was going to be, or would be, about 20 years from the time in which Isaiah is prophesying. What about Judah, the southern kingdom? Initially at 606, finally, a second carrying away. That was a carrying away into Babylonian captivity, a second carrying away in 597, and then actually the city is destroyed in 586. So let's just say 135 years from the time in which Isaiah is prophesying. Long after Isaiah is dead, gone from the scene. But yet he was to prophesy until these cities be destroyed and the inhabitants taken away. Now, how is he going to do that? He's dead.
His word is going to be...
Okay, by the word, and in reality, the word in written form. He's going to write down his message. And as a result, they would have that, and he would be preaching to them. He would be telling them until they are destroyed, and actually continues long after that. We also notice, and we'll stop with this point, maybe emphasize it a little bit, but the promised land. This is the promised land that we're dealing with. That promised land and its possession by Israel was always dependent upon Israel's faithfulness to God, their continued faithfulness. When they departed from God, they lost the land. It was not an unconditional promise of that land. It was a conditional promise of the land. You remain faithful, you'll remain in the land. You become unfaithful, you'll be taken into captivity and you'll lose the land. Dale?
You change references, you see that's been the case throughout history. For example, when he was speaking to Abraham, he explained the reason for his statement that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So the same thing that happened to the Amorites when they were expelled by the Israelites happened to the Israelites when they were expelled by the Assyrians and Nebuchadnezzar. Their iniquity became full too.
Well, the problem with that, Dale, is that the land that the Amorites possessed was not promised to them by God. This land, the land of Canaan, that they took from the Amorites and those other nations, was promised to them by God. But it was a conditional promise of their remaining faithful to God. And when they did not retain that faithfulness, they lost the land. And that's what you're saying here. You proclaim this, how long? Till the nations are destroyed. Because the people's heart is rebellious. We'll start with verse 13 then, Lord willing, next week.